This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. 7 decades after Japan adopted its post-World War II Constitution, questions are being raised in the country about whether it's time to rethink its pacifist constraints. Article 9 of the document expressly forbids Japan from maintaining a military with offensive war-making capabilities. But with a conservative government in place and North Korean missiles rattling the electorate, is Japan in a mood to rearm? Our guest today is uniquely qualified to put the current political debate in Japan in its historical context. David Buck has kept a watchful eye on developments in the region for many years. He serves as Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he established himself as one of the nation's preeminent Asia scholars. David, welcome back to International Focus.
Pleasure to be here, Doug.
Well, in terms of context and history, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about just the situation surrounding the drafting of that 1947 Constitution.
Well, it was really drafted by Douglas MacArthur's staff. He was the head of the occupation of the Allied occupation of Japan, and his staff drafted it. However, it was strongly supported by one of the most pacifist or peaceful members of the Japanese political elite, former Prime Minister Shihara, who had was a proponent back in the 1920s of really pacifist and non-aggressive policies. So he was actually an obvious choice to work with the post-World War II occupation, and that's what he did. And they drafted this Constitution, which in its preamble and Article 9 both have strong statements that Japan is going to renounce war, and it has remained popular. Japan has really been under the American defensive umbrella since that time, and they've relied on the United States for a lot of their defense. However, they have a self-defense force which has an army, a navy, and an air force of considerable size and considerable ability that is seen to fall within the parameters of the Constitution at Article 9, because it's not supposed to be an aggressive force, but for self-defense.
Well, it might be useful for me to just read this verbatim, the Article 9, so we know what we're talking about. And it says, and I'm quoting here, "Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized."
You already noticed that, in fact, the self-defense force contradicts part of that.
Well, if I could, I mean, I'll just look at some of these statistics. The Navy has 45,000 sailors, 47 surface ships, 18 submarines. The Air Force, 47,000 airmen with 552 combat aircraft. Similar numbers for the Army. So this is not mall cops by any means.
No, it's not. But the Liberal Democratic Party, which has controlled Japan since the late 1940s, has always been in favor of having this kind of a military force. So there's always been a contest to try to expand it. And the Prime Minister Abe, his grandfather was a prime minister, and he was one of the advocates of more defense, of a more defensive posture.
Well, and in fact, that was one of the objectives of the Liberal Democratic Party from the start, wasn't it? Sort
Absolutely.
of a more expansionist reading of that, if not just getting rid of Article 9 altogether.
Right.
Well, so let's talk a little bit. I think we've got a picture of the current Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, and let's talk a little bit about who he is and where he came from.
Well, he's comes from a very political family. As I said, his grandfather was Kishi, was a prime minister and was one of the advocates of a stronger, more militarized Japan. However, the public has always been against that. That's never stopped the LDP from pushing for it. The LDP has been in charge for so long, and they're so strong that, in fact, they're competing factions within the LDP. Kind of, as we know in our Republican Party now, they're really strong factions that are opposing one another. That's what the LDP has been like for the past 60 years, and he's always been and his family have always been in a very conservative position. He tried in 2005 and again in 2007 to try to alter the Constitution, this article to increase the military forces. It wasn't done. And he hopes to, and he's taking advantage of the current North Korean belligerency and their use and their firing of these rockets that go that can carry atomic weapons over Japan to try to get this through by 2020. His goal is to modify Article 9 of the Constitution by 2020, and he's one of his major efforts.
So, there's a very strident approach towards defense. People have tried to, in some way, put the LDP and the current government into more or less the same basket of sort of this populist wave in other parts of the world. But really, they are anything but populist outsiders, are they not?
Absolutely, absolutely. They're establishment people through and through. Even the people who oppose them are conservatives. The Democratic Party is the second largest party. They're conservatives. The third smaller party, Komeito, again, it's essentially an establishment party affiliated with Japanese Buddhism, and so it is. It's a very conservative country. There aren't very many populists in Japan.
Well,
or populist politicians, I should say.
So I don't know if it's of note, but Mr. Abe is the first PM that was born after World War II.
No, I think you have to look at his family roots. I think that's his grandfather Kishi was, in fact, at the end of World War II, was declared a Class A military criminal. So the family has been aligned with the most conservative elements in Japanese politics since long before the Second World War.
Well, let's talk about some of that. There are sort of touchstones within Japanese society that are available to people with those sensitivities. And one, if you could talk a little bit about the Yokozuna Shrine.
Oh, Yokozuna Shrine, right. That's for honoring Japanese war dead. And it's a point of great contention because many of the people who were declared criminals by international tribunals, again, these were tribunals that were really controlled by the victors, by the Americans and our allies. They declared many of the people who were the leaders of the Japanese war effort as war criminals, and yet they're enshrined at the Yokozuna Shrine, and there are visits by prime ministers there, and every time a prime minister goes there, there are loud cries from the Chinese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, and others who have suffered from the Japanese in World War II. So that will remain as, yet the Japanese see it as their war dead, and they want to, and they celebrate and at least respect or rear the war criminals along with the rest of the Japanese.
And there are publishing houses affiliated with other organizations that are very keen to get different historical narratives into textbooks, for example.
Exactly. There's long been a very contentious questions about what goes into Japanese school textbooks and how World War II is represented. Again, though, we have to remember that in spite of all this education that kind of tries to cover over what happened in World War II, among the Japanese populace, there is a general recognition of that Japan did terrible things in World War II, and it's a blot on the country. A lot of it goes to the Japanese sense that they should not have there shouldn't be anything wrong, dirty in Japanese politics, in a way, and Japanese history, that the emperor and the Japanese people should be seen as upright and clean. They don't want to admit their mistakes. They're not alone in that as nations, but it's very strong in Japan.
So let's turn to the current political scene. So Prime Minister Abe has just decided to call a snap election, at least a year ahead of time. So what was that about? What's the political calculus on his part for that?
Well, the calculus is that these North Korean missile tests, in which these very powerful missiles fueled by some propellants that we didn't think that the North Koreans had, are as we know, may possibly even be able to strike the United States, probably can carry nuclear warheads, and obviously Japan would be could be a target for them. And if a misfire ever occurred with a nuclear weapon aboard, it would really threaten Japan, or they could directly attack Japan, where American troops are based. So that is really what prompted him to call this election. He thought that this might be a good time for him to be able to go for a third term. He's been in power since 2012, and he thinks if he can get reelected here, he can go on up to beyond that 2020 date when he wants to revise the Constitution. So it looks like a good time for him.
So it could be a bit like Theresa May's calculus in the UK. So I need a stronger mandate to proceed with Brexit. So let's call an election and see what happens.
Exactly.
So people are saying there's the possibility, of course, that it could end with the same surprising result as it did in the UK, and in part because of a new party, and we've got a picture of someone who is contesting Mr. Abe in the election, Yukio Kyoke?
No, Koike.
Koike, all right.
I hope I have not heard the name pronounced, but I hope my Japanese pronunciation is correct. But
and
she is now the governor of Tokyo, which, as we know, is a huge center of politics, commerce, everything in Japan. And she overnight, just within the past week, declared a new party, the Party of Hope. And the Democratic Party, the second largest party, has said they want to join her. So she's trying to use this as a lever to unseat the LDP. There are even some members of the LDP that might join her, and so it's a real challenge. She won a huge election this past summer in Tokyo, and she has been associated. She's been associated with the LDP, but
was in the cabinet at one
in
point,
the cabinet at one point. But this is this fractious nature of that LDP coalition, which is so broad, so big, that it has within it the seeds of its own dissolution. And she wants to dissolve it, really.
Well, in terms of the attempts to alter the Constitution, currently the LDP enjoys a supermajority in the legislature. So what would it mean if, I think few people suspect that she's actually going to prevail. I think, it will be a matter of peeling away some seats in the legislature. So even if they succeeded just to that extent, where the majority of the LDP and Mr. Abe enjoy right now is diminished, how does that affect prospects for changing the Constitution?
Well, that's very hard to judge, Doug, because, again, these people all turn out to be so conservative that I'm not at all sure that even if she were got a much stronger position, she would really work hard against revising Article 9 in the Constitution. But the problem is the LDP has been in charge. They've had the whip hand and this supermajority for a long period of time. It never has enabled them to do it. So if cut back, it will make it even harder for Abe to really revise the Constitution.
But we touched a little bit on just the impact on the part of the electorate of these tests and provocations from North Korea. Do you think it's reached some sort of emotional tipping point where that historical reluctance to do that may be changing?
Could be. It could be. But you have to remember that not only are they worried, are the Japanese worried about North Korea, but they're also worried about increasing Chinese competition. So I think that's not actually being talked about very much. But I noted the other day that Mazda Corporation is joining Toyota Corporation in trying to manufacture electric and self-driving cars. Doesn't sound like much, but those are two huge automobile companies. Are they worried about competition from American and United States automakers? Yes, but they're also worried about competition from Chinese big companies, the big, huge state-owned industries, which are going to invest a huge amount of money in this technology. So I think at the same time that there is this military concern, there's also a concern that the growing military and economic power of China may take part of Japan's economic strength away from it. Japan has been in the doldrums, since the early 1990s. It's started to do a little bit better now. It's a little bit stronger in the past couple of years, but still, it has big challenges, and I think it's looking more and more not to Europe and the United States as the challenger, but China.
So on a lot of these issues, is there a generational component to it? I mean, are you likely to find more conservatism in the classic sense and among older Japanese?
I think so. However, the big thing about the Japanese population is it's aging and declining. Russia has declining population, but Japan, people are predicting that Japan, within 50 years, it's now about 127 million people, could be under 90 million people. So they're facing a declining marriage and birth rate that is really kind of unprecedented. I think that those kinds of things do not seem to make the younger Japanese much more liberal than the older Japanese. In fact, the older generations in Japan really control a lot.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is just how the current political situation in the U.S. impacts this discussion in Japan. And talk a little bit, if you will, about the Trump administration's approach towards Japanese military capability and Japan's ability to carry more of the load.
Well, as we know, the Trump administration wants everybody to carry more of the military load, in NATO in particular, but they would also favor it in Japan. They certainly would favor the Japanese to do more. But I'm not sure that would sway the Japanese public. Japan paid such a terrible price for their military aggression, and I still think that those words of the Article 9 and the preamble of the Constitution still ring very strong in all age groups. They do not want to have another war. They don't want to have a nuclear war to devastate their country. And you notice the Japanese reaction to the Fukushima disaster, where their nuclear plants were destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami. It's seen as a terrible blot. They are very fearful of atomic power and nuclear power and the threats of nuclear war. So I think there's still going to be a very strong pacifist push in Japan.
Well, which would suggest perhaps Mr. Abe is getting out ahead of the public a bit. He had an op-ed in the New York Times in September of this year, 2017, in which he said in part, "I firmly support the United States position that all options are on the table with regard to North Korea."
Yes.
So he is not shying away from a military response.
No, he's not. And he's been very supportive of President Trump. He really has. We couldn't ask for a more supportive ally in the Pacific than Japan, and that has always been the case. And that is not true of South Korea, however. They are not as supportive because if the United States were to attack North Korea, the North Koreans would obviously be, in response, attack South Korea, and they also view the North Koreans as their fellow Koreans. So they're not nearly as supportive of the Trump approach to the crisis with North Korea as are the Japanese.
Well, and of course there's a long history between Japan and Korea generally that still, I think, impacts the situation.
It does. And we also have to remember that the North Korean government has always been more aligned with Japan's opponents, even going back to the Second World War, the origins of the North Korean regime lay in the Soviet Union.
Well, in response to the latest round of sanctions, which Japan was very much in favor of, an official body of Pyongyang issued the following statement: "The 4 islands of the archipelago should be sunken into the sea by nuclear bombs of Juche. Japan is no longer needed to exist near us." So what does that do to popular sentiment around these issues?
Well, I'm sure it makes the Japanese more determined to cling closely to their American allies and to consider rearmament. Yes, clearly. This kind of language, as we know, does not lead to good results.
Well, we've got under a minute left, but where is South Korea in this equation? I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of U.S.-Japan, but how does South Korea feel about a more militarily capable Japan?
That I don't think is. I don't think that they're very much in favor of it. But I don't think that the South Koreans really view themselves as able to control or even influence this. They realize that these things are going to be decided by the great powers, and South Korea is not in a position, I think, to really affect this.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. David Buck, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Doug.
To our viewers, see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.